Native Hawaiian elderly population in participating in clinical research. However, we think that's the best methodology, so that's what we're doing. What? So don't shoot yourself in the foot. Problem and alternative approach, or what you'll do in order to alleviate it. I said before, I always give a rationale. You guys want to learn to love the word rationale when you're writing a grant. You can, I don't want to say hide a lot of things behind a rationale, it's not what I mean, but when I'm talking about what I'm proposing to do, I never just say, this is what I'm proposing to do. I always start thinking, and it's probably because I spend too much time thinking about grants, but you sort of get yourself paranoid. And again, it's not a bad thing to be when you're writing a grant. You get paranoid and you start thinking, what are they going to complain about? Because they're certainly going to complain about something. You know, that's their job. They're reviewers. They can look for things to criticize. When you write a grant, you'll always know what the soft spots are. You'll always have concerns. You'll think, well, I hope they don't notice. Here's a weakness. Here's sort of a weakness, da-da-da. In the rationale, we argue against some perceived weaknesses. So let me show you what I mean. And I'm not even going to read this to you. I'm going to tell you what's in here. When I wrote that grant, in which I proposed a grant writing workshop for underrepresented minority investigators, I was at Johns Hopkins when I wrote that grant, and as part of that grant, it was so important to me to be able to bring investigators from these different institutions first to Hopkins and spend a couple of days with them. And I proposed, I think it was a 2-day on-site training. It was very important to me. I was absolutely wedded to this. The rest of the grant writing training was going to be by distance learning, much as you know, I'm going to work with some people. But it was terribly important to me to meet people face to face. There are a lot of reasons for it. And I thought, you know I'm going to be criticized for this. It's so expensive to take investigators from all over the U.S. and bring them to Hopkins. It's going to cost a fortune in terms of bringing them here, housing them, feeding them, all this stuff. Very, very expensive. I know I'll get criticized. But I didn't feel like I could give it up. It was too important to me. So I gave a rationale. Here's why it's so important to bring everyone to Hopkins. So I diffused this criticism through my rationale. Use a rationale to diffuse criticisms. You will always know what likely criticisms are. Believe me. They will keep you awake nights. They'll make you scratch your head. They'll absolutely drive you crazy, all these different weaknesses, and you will know them better than anyone. Your colleagues will tell you, but you don't even need them to tell you. You will know. To the best of your ability, use this section called rationale. It's not a requirement. It's a great way to argue against why some of these things, which could diffuse your research, some of these potential problems, in your rationale, you talk about why you're doing it this way, why this is the right approach. It is a very useful protocol. For those of you who are doing human subjects research, I included this just as bullet points that I hope will be useful to you when you're writing up your own protocol. The protocol, typically for a grant, it's going to be short because you have the human subjects section. I'd say typical protocol, half a page for each aid, 2/3 a page, something like that. Here are the typical headings. You want to talk about the study design. It's a matched cohort study. This is why we chose this particular type of trial. Human subjects. Recruitment. Recruitment is always a bag of worms. There are always going to be problems with recruitment. I don't care what type of study you're looking at. Recruitment is always a nightmare. And it never turns out the way you think it will. Never, never. So, knowing that, and knowing that your reviewers are going to look at your recruitment and think, oh, look at this optimistic investigator. They say they're going to recruit 100 people, and that's what they need for statistical significance, and they have 100 people with this illness who come through the hospital a year. Well, what are they going to do about all the people who say no, who drop out of the study, who change their mind? So, knowing that, when we talk about recruitment, we're always going to have plans for over-enrollment to allow for dropout, to allow for problems. Always include over-enrollment, because you know you're going to get nailed for it. So anticipate it, address it. population characteristics. Talk about inclusion, exclusion criteria, informed consent procedures. And again, many of you are looking at very vulnerable populations, Native Hawaiians, Alaskan population, any population that is socioeconomically disadvantaged. Pregnant women, doesn't get more vulnerable than that. You guys are looking at very vulnerable populations. Vulnerable populations are certainly terribly important to study, but be aware that they're going to really look at this to make sure that you are protecting these populations. And you think, okay, no problem. I'll, make sure that I get this through the IRB. So here's what I want you to know. Even though you put in your protocol for doing a human subject study, and you think, okay, now it's ironclad, your reviewers can still come back and criticize you and come back with questions about human subjects, even though it's been approved at your institution. And I was so shocked to learn that. I thought that once it was approved, that was the end of it, but you can be criticized. So remember that there's an increasing emphasis, particularly on vulnerable populations right now. What else do you include in protocol? Certainly an outline of your experiments, what procedures you'll be doing, interventions, variables to be measured. And those are standard categories. And again, I included this as a checklist for you when you're writing your own grants, so I hope it'll be useful to you. So I want to say a couple of words about data, and I hesitate to say this because I know biostatisticians are as rare as a hen's teeth, but I do want to talk to you about data. Don't just be a number scratcher. If you have significant data, you do want to include a biostatistician, and I know it's an issue. I know it's hard to find them, but you definitely want to contract with someone and include them as a consultant. Look, you can pay them subsequently when this grant gets funded. So even if the biostatistician isn't here, if you find a biostatistician on the mainland that you can include, terrific. Biostatisticians tend to look for grants because they, for the most part, obviously can't write their own grants. And they will tell you what % effort to include them for. Why is it so important? Why am I really belaboring this? Criticisms of grants, it's almost like they go in and out of fashion. The top 3 criticisms now are probably different from what they'll be in a couple of years. Right now, one of the major criticisms that we see of grants across the board has to do with data analysis. And the words we tend to see, insufficient data analysis, the lack of data analysis. It's just such a common criticism. Honestly, I would say it's among the top 3 across the board of grants right now. So knowing that, find a biostatistician, and I know that can sound easy to do, but I'm sure, through your research coordinators here, I'm sure it's possible to identify someone and even to have a retainer for a biostatistician so that this person works with you on the grant. So remember, you'll be cutting this person in for % effort after the grant gets funded. Since you're going to pay this person, let them write the biostatistics, the data analysis section, because this is what they do for a living, and you can absolutely guarantee that they'll do a better job than you unless you're a statistician yourself. This is what they do. They're very, very good at it. And again, the most common criticisms you see in this are like lack of sample size, lack of power calculations, you use repeated t-tests, which you should have used a more comprehensive modeling approach, use of statistical tests that assume normality, treating continuous variables as dichotomous, no consideration of covariant effects. Why do I include this level of detail? Because here's the point I'm trying to make. If you look at this slide, you have no idea what some of these points are, then I've made my point. You need a statistician. And I took this for your amusement from George Bernard Shaw, who wrote more than a century ago. He wrote this wonderful novel, The Doctor's Dilemma. And even he knew about all the common fallacies and stuff that occurs in data analysis. So George Bernard Shaw wrote, thus it's easy to prove that the wearing of tall hats and the carrying of umbrellas enlarges the chest, prolongs life, and confers comparative immunity from disease. For the statistics show us that the class which uses these articles